Thank you for listening to the Open Discourse Podcast. I'm Charles Mitchell, co-founder and CEO of the Open Discourse Coalition. In this series, I interview thought leaders, elected officials, entrepreneurs, and other change agents. Today, I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Dawn Toguchi, Executive Director of the Open Discourse Coalition. Dawn Toguchi, welcome back to the Open Discourse Podcast. This is a special occasion. I'm proving it for those of our viewers and listeners who are watching on YouTube as opposed to listening on an audio-only platform, because I am wearing my Christmas beard, and a new little fun tradition that I've started this year. This is a new tradition also that we're going to start this year, a year in review podcast, looking back on the year of programming that we've done at ODC. This is a noble tradition, if you ask me, and also a great year to look back on, because we have never served more students more effectively, both at Bucknell University and beyond, than we have this year. So, Dawn, I'm delighted to be able to debrief all of this for our listeners with you. Thanks for joining me today.
It is my pleasure.
Now, I'm going to give a little spoiler, Dawn. At the very end of this episode, I'm going to ask you for the most memorable part of your year, 2025, as the Executive Director of the Open Discourse Coalition. So for those of you that are listening, you better stick around, because you want to hear what Dawn has to say. She's seen and heard and participated in and led a lot this year. Usually this is much more of an interview show. Today, this will be a little bit more of a conversation. So I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator, Dawn, and tell you my favorite moment from this year, which you probably know a little bit about, but maybe not a lot, and certainly our listeners, it's going to be news to them. It occurred in my office in October. Most of our listeners know, you certainly know, that our signature, keystone, longest-standing program here at the ODC is our leadership seminar, taught by Professor Bill Gruber. We innovated a bit this year with the leadership seminar. We began with a seminar led by two Bucknell faculty. Dawn, you organized that seminar. Could you summarize that a little bit for our listeners, and then I'll tell you what it has to do with my favorite memory from this year?
Absolutely. Well, our leadership seminar students, as the seminar began, we gave them an introduction to capital markets and investing, and helped each of them open personal investment accounts. And for all of those who successfully completed the seminar at the end of September, we funded those accounts with $1,000. So on the very first day of their class at, I think, 8 a.m., they showed up, and we walked through opening the accounts, the X's and O's of that. But more importantly, as you mentioned, we had two faculty members who gave them, this group of not just business students, but engineers, humanities majors, a quick course on capital markets and investing.
And who were those professors, Dawn?
That was Professor Dave Jensen and Professor Stacy Mastrolia.
Yeah, it's a great example of one of the themes we're going to talk about this year, new partnerships. That was the first time that particular thing had been done by those particular professors, and it marked a new and greater level of involvement for them in the ODC, and that was a great thing in and of itself. Now, for those who don't live and breathe the work the way that you and I do, and maybe don't take college classes these days, I'll just say a quick word about why we did that thing. The students who enroll in the leadership seminar do not receive course credit. It is not a Bucknell University or any other university course. It's an independent seminar, so that it doesn't compete with their courses. It is 6 hours on Saturday, all day, every Saturday in September. As a former student of Professor Gruber's, I can attest that if you sign up for all day with him on Saturday, you are not only giving up your Saturday, you are giving up your Friday night. There's required reading, just like for a normal class. There's preparation. There's all kinds of things. So it impedes these students' abilities to get a job. And for that reason, since the beginning of the seminar in 2021 as an independent program, there's been a stipend, and you referenced that in your comments, Dawn. What we changed this year was providing the stipend as a jumpstart into the capital markets, providing it in the form of ETFs. And I'll say it was one of my favorite memories. It's not my true favorite, but one of the little pieces that I had the fun of adding to that was after you and Bill certified that the students had done what they were supposed to do, they came to my office to finalize the paperwork for their ETFs and to get a copy of Ken Langone's book, I Love Capitalism, since they're getting a little taste of capitalism. They earned it. They gave up the opportunity to get a job in September. They did a lot of work, et cetera. So I think it'd be fair to say they earned that money. But we also wanted to give them a little bit of thematic information as well in the form of the book. Well, my favorite memory, I promised you I would tell you, Dawn, came in one of those, what I expected to be pretty quick 10-minute meetings. Hey, congratulations, shake your hand. Let me check over your paperwork. Here's a copy of Mr. Langone's book. Enjoy. One student stopped me cold. And that student's name, you know him. His name is Stevie Seller. And for our listeners, Stevie will actually be the next guest on this podcast. So tune in next Friday. Stevie said, hey, Charles, thanks so much for all this. I look forward to reading Mr. Langone's book. I'm excited to be able to get a start in the capital markets. And as he said, as you know, because I knew him well enough to know that he is of the Jewish faith. He's one of the leaders of Chabad, the student Jewish group that we do a lot to support. He said, in my faith tradition, we tithe. Now, I knew that term. Maybe not everyone knows that term, but it's an Old Testament tradition, usually considered to mean giving the first 10% of something you receive. There's debate about the numbers. We could get into a whole theological discussion next time. But when Stevie said all that, my ears perked up because I know about his faith tradition. I know what tithing is. And he said, I want to tithe a portion of my ETFs back to the Open Discourse Coalition because this opportunity that you guys have given me means so much to me. As the head of the organization, as a student of Groover, knowing that Stevie earned that money and he earned it good, the fact that he wanted to do that to, as they say, pay it forward, to show his gratitude, to make this opportunity available to somebody else. I've never, ever, ever, ever had anyone, let alone a student, let alone somebody who just graduated, say, hey, man, this means so much to me that I want to tithe back to this organization. So for me, Dawn, that's my favorite part of 2025. I think that just embodies for me why it's the right thing to do for us to serve students like Stevie. And by the way, we're going to come back to Stevie and the group of students of which he's part, because as we unfold this past year, we're going to talk about really three things. We're going to talk about new series of programming. We're going to talk about new partnerships. One of our partnerships that has really intensified this year is with the Jewish community at Bucknell, and specifically Chabad, the student group of which Stevie is part. We'll talk more about that. And also new places. We have been able to take even that leadership seminar guy, Professor Bill Groover, to other places, and our work to other colleges and universities that are asking for it in 2025. So we'll unfold all that, and at the very end, Dawn, you're going to get your opportunity to tell our listeners your favorite, okay? So let's get into some of the new series of programming that we've been able to execute this year. One of them is relevant to what you were talking about a minute ago. You talked about how with the leadership seminar, among many other important things, we've gotten students some training and some exposure to capital markets. Well, we have a newly expanded series of programming this year on capitalism and capital markets. It's bigger and better than it's ever been. It's going to be even cooler in 2026. We have a previous episode about that with visiting academic fellow Kimberly Josephson, who's going to be visiting Bucknell in 2026. But this is not about 2026. Can you share with our listeners how the capitalism and capital markets series reached more students and had more value in 2025 than ever before, Dawn?
Capitalism and Capital Markets workshop started with a little workshop that Kirk Cornwell, one of our advisory board members and Bucknell alum, began around a table at ODC with about 8 students speaking about investments and mergers and acquisitions and his career at PwC.
And that didn't begin this year. That began a couple years ago.
Yep, that began a few years ago. And that grew in popularity and we formalized it more, partnering with faculty such as Professor Dave Jensen and others in the Freeman College of Management to get the word out about this kind of program. So Kirk Cornwell still does a workshop that does the basics of capital markets and gives students a nice foundational understanding, which is especially helpful for younger students and for students who are interested in business courses but are not business majors. And then we've paired that with Greg Smith, a previous podcast guest, who can talk more deeply about mergers and acquisitions due to his career at Roar Capital. So in this past year, Greg also brought another Bucknell alum, Sean Huss, so that they could give the perspective of the investment firm and the bank about doing a deal together. They did this in Holmes Hall. Greg also did an add-on session, if you will, for us at the Bull Run.
If there's
And
any
where he
more
just,
iconic
yeah.
destination for a Bucknellian than Holmes Hall, I would say that it was the Bull Run, Don.
We're just hitting all the big ones in Lewisburg. Yeah. And we sat around a very, very full table at Bull Run. We had more students than we had seats, and people were literally eating their dinner out of their laps because Greg just opened up the conversation. It was an ask me anything about deals, career, getting success on Wall Street or elsewhere. And that was really a highlight of the year for me. And something that stood out was that we had students who were inviting their classmates, students who were literally coming in off the street because they saw a sign for it, and students from kind of all the colleges. And afterwards, I got an email from an attendee who I didn't know personally. And she said, "Thank you so much. What else do you have in this series? I'm an engineer, but I'm really interested in careers in finance. And I just don't have the opportunity to take classes or courses or extracurriculars like this. So let me know." So that's something that's really neat about ODC programming is that it provides access to students in all three of the colleges, kind of no matter the topic that we're discussing.
There's several really cool things to me about what you just said, Dawn, that are emblematic of what we've done in 2025, but also of how far ODC has come in 5 years. So first of all, Kirk Cornwell, who you mentioned, has been very, very involved at our alma mater for decades, former chair of the advisory board of Freeman College of Management. Wonderful that Kurt continues to give back. Greg Smith and Sean Huss, I believe Greg said on this podcast, he hadn't been back to Bucknell in decades until he came back for the first capitalism and capital markets program that he did a couple years ago. Sean Huss, who came back this spring with him, similarly had not been back in decades. To me, it's a beautiful thing to create an opportunity for these fellow alums to come back. And nothing against coming back and hanging out at the Bull Run, but they're not just hanging out at the Bull Run. They're coming back and investing in the lives of young people. They find it powerful. And in the photos that we put up earlier, I think our viewers can see not only are there large numbers of students who come out, but they're engaged. And you witnessed it that night at the Bull Run, Dawn. Another piece of it that comes out when I listen to you talk about that is I have a test for our events. I call it the bar test. You can really tell if students are engaged with something if they, now, let me caveat. We mentioned that the Greg Smith capitalism capital markets thing was at the Bull Run. It was at a table, as you said. It was in the back
Yes.
room. It was not at the bar.
Yeah.
And not everybody there was legal. Okay. Little caveat. My test is the students who are legal, if they invite the speaker to the bar afterwards, that is the true sign that the event was a win. And as I recall, Greg Smith passed the bar test. You all
Oh my
migrated.
gosh, I couldn't even hang. Greg is on our advisory board. I'm not in Lewisburg for every single program. So yes, Greg passed the bar test. We went to the bar and they were asking so many questions. And I thought I'm going to stick around for this. I don't get to do this very often. Greg's very important to us. And at a certain point, Charles, I had to call it. And they still were asking questions of him. But to your point about it being a reflection of their engagement with the students. I mean, they really are investing in the students. And I mean, at that dinner, I can't tell you the number of times that an alum, a young alum named Dirk, came up. Everyone was saying, "How's Dirk doing? What's he doing for you? Oh my gosh, did Dirk do that?" Because Dirk is a student that met Greg in a prior visit through the series and now works at Rourke with Greg. And so that is the type of engagement and investment that these are sparking and that these really generous alumni are making possible.
Yes, yes, and it brings out a couple other things too. I think, Dawn. One that is actually reported in one of the local newspapers this week. There can be a perception that so much of what we do at ODC is about big controversial political issues, and we did do some programming on that in 2025, and that's part of our mission. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But there's also much of what we do that isn't about those kinds of issues at all, but is still about important discussions, dialogue, et cetera, that is really important to students' lives and that they say they don't have enough opportunities to get, and they want those opportunities. And I think that is actually a perfect tie-in to one of the other series that we created in 2025 and has really grown. One that also passed the bar test, by the way, and that being our faith, family, and business series. Similar in what you've been talking about, in the sense that it's bringing some really accomplished people to campus, Bucknellian and non-Bucknellian, but with a very different lens. Could you share more with our listeners about what that is?
Yes. So this series is allowing students to hear from really successful professionals, not just about the career path that they chose or the books that they recommend or how to get there and make a lot of money. It's about the holistic view of life and success, and how faith and family, as we know, a few years removed from college, that has a huge significance about the path you take and how you end up defining success. So to have professionals come in and really candidly discuss that has been very impactful. And like, listen, I mean, some of the programs I'm most proud of are the ones that we have tackled, things like abortion or gun control or President Trump. But these types of conversations about having kids and having a job and working with your spouse. I mean, these are the ones that are actually, in many ways, changing lives. I mean, you were just telling me about a student whose possible path has dramatically changed thanks to having kind of frank conversation around those topics.
Yeah, and another one of my reflections, Dawn, is while I wholeheartedly believe we have to do both types of programming, in the culture that we're living in today, it's not the culture I want to live in, but it's the culture we're living in today. With the landmines that we have to deal with today, there is another piece of value to the kinds of conversations that you were just talking about that aren't political. And that is, I think students are much more willing to turn out. We still have good turnout for our events that are on more political issues, but my observation is there's a hurdle you have to get over to convince someone to come out for something on abortion or something on gun control or something on President Trump or something on whatever, that is a little bit easier when you're talking through the lens of this is something that's going to matter to your life. And it's not just my opinion. As you know, there are data that show that reticence on the part of students. On some previous episodes of this podcast, we've talked about surveys from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression in Philadelphia, where they talked about how 1 in 3 college students thinks that it's appropriate to respond to language or words that you don't like with violence. And we've talked about how troubling that is. But there's another side to that, which is the 2 out of 3 know about the 1 out of 3. And they know that, sadly, events that didn't used to get messy in this way can actually turn violent, and therefore they are loath to come out. And I want you to say more about those statistics in a minute, but I can't resist saying, especially at the holidays, how many reminders of that we've gotten this year. And we got one of those reminders just recently. I started off earlier by talking about student named Stevie and the Chabad student group that we support. Well, a few days before this podcast episode was Hanukkah. It's you know, I have my Christmas beard on, but Hanukkah is really important too. And as I'm sure all of our listeners know, there was a massacre in Sydney this last weekend where those who were celebrating Hanukkah, many were shot and killed. Actually, one of those who died at that event was a dear friend of the rabbi of Chabad Lewisburg, who is the spiritual leader to Stevie and many of these other students. We had the honor the day after that of hosting the students' Hanukkah celebration. And thanks to the generosity of our donors, we had lots and lots and lots and lots of security, and thank God all went well. I say that to say not just how great we are. That's not the point. It's our honor to be able to create those opportunities for students, but because I think it's important for our listeners to understand just how serious the threat of violence or the threat of retribution or all these things, which we all know are important, or we wouldn't be doing this work, but how tangibly they affect students' attitudes. So one, I think that's why it's important. We have to offer a broad range of programming, some of which is not quite as fraught and doesn't make you feel that feeling in your gut the way that you do about some things. But secondly, can you share a little bit of the data that we've been talking about to show this is not just Charles Mitchell's opinion. This is a real thing, the reticence that students feel.
Right. Let me pull this up here. But these are more findings from FIRE about students' attitudes, especially in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination that happened just this fall semester. But half of students say they're less comfortable attending or hosting controversial public events after that assassination. Moderate and conservative students are less likely to say that shouting down a speaker or blocking entry or using violence is acceptable, but liberal students' support for these tactics has held steady or even increased slightly. And it's just going back to that reticence and where you kind of look at what is the risk of this. We've always talked about social risk when you and I were students. That was really what it was simply social risk. How nerdy did we look? How out there? How unpopular were our opinions? But now students have to consider literally their safety at a point here. It's not just about social stuff. It's not just about even bad grades, but it's much more serious than that. And the only way that we can change these forces in our society is to talk more, is to build relationships, is to tackle big and small issues. And I think that, like you said, a lot of those more personal ones or the softer ones, or, whether it's great books or religion or journalism or American revolutionary history, working those muscles are what is going to help us better understand that we can talk to people who are very different from us, and we can have a disagreement, and that we can then apply those same tools to discussions about immigration and tariffs and abortion.
Yeah. And Dawn, I want to ask you in a couple minutes to talk about some of the other news series as we launched in 2025 that are relevant to everything you just said. But I can't help making a quick comment about something I've tried to do personally in 2025 about what you're saying, other than keeping our work going and all that, which is to buy a grill. And this was also brought up in the prior episode of our podcast with Coach Mike Binney of the golf team. He talked a lot about one of our new traditions that he appreciates called Red Friday. You're familiar, you've attended. Red, RED, standing for Remember Everyone Deployed. Just a very simple tradition we've started once a month. I light up a grill outside, grill some, initially it was red meat, then as it grew and as some people shared their dietary restrictions, including some of the Jewish students and some people who just don't like beef, we've diversified the menu a little bit. But the heart of it is some really nice food, some people that are kind and caring, and an opportunity to have a moment of silence for our troops who are deployed. You don't have to agree with American foreign policy. You don't have to like the commander in chief. We've had it under two different commanders in chief so far. It started just me and 10 students who had an idea, and now has mushroomed. I think the last couple of months we had 60 and 70 students total. The last couple of months of the semester. From my perspective, why do I do that? Is it because I like steak? Sure. Is it because I'm grateful for those who've served? Absolutely. Is it that I love being around students and faculty members and community members and bringing them all together? Absolutely. But to your point earlier, Dawn, part of it is simply about muscle memory. It's a way for a student to actually walk over the threshold into an ODC event, into that uncharted territory with as little barrier from the stuff you were talking about earlier as humanly possible. There's not yet going to be a discussion about a fraught issue. There's not even going to be much of a discussion about any particular issue. Our program probably lasts a few minutes. It's gotten a little bit longer because we've started having the ROTC cadets present the colors, and we'll get into ROTC in a minute. But for me, that's part of why I think it's important even to have this discussion and lay out the broad swath of programming that we're doing. Because if we want students to be comfortable having some of the really, 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 really tough discussions, there's groundwork that we have to lay.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about the students these days, they grew up with smartphones and social media. They were in formative educational years during COVID shutdowns. They've seen some really ugly election cycles. And then now they've been students on campus when there's been violence and assassinations for speaking out. So there's a lot at work there. And that's why some of this seems basic, working on those muscle memory, but getting students in front of other people and engaging, and not just students, frankly, we can all benefit from it. But it is especially important with this generation of students.
Yeah. Okay. Dawn, let's rapid fire through a few other ways we serve those students. Another bigger and better series this year began previously, but is much improved, is the Pathways series led by our colleague, Ed Robinson. Could you share a little bit about that in 2025?
Yes, Ed Robinson is our alumni fellow and has really done a fantastic job of developing the Pathways series that includes from one-on-one mentorship to the packed campus theater for a documentary screening and kind of everything in between. And what Ed's programming focuses on is talking about the pathway to success, whatever that looks like, recognizing that many Bucknell students have a start and end point in mind and feel like there's courses and internships and steps to check off that list to get to what they where they believe they're heading. But as we all know, that is rarely, if ever, a straight line and a path that you can completely control. And so Ed brings in alumni and parents and other professionals to speak about their pathway, what they've learned along the way, how they've adapted, and really encouraging students to broaden their thinking and challenge their preconceptions and prepare for that kind of flexibility that's needed. And going back to what you were saying, this is something that Ed and I have talked a lot about with working those muscles, about talking about things that students either they're all thinking about anyway, or they're maybe talking to one or two others about, but how can we bring that into a bigger dialogue and help them out and incorporate, people who have lived lived this as well into the conversation. So that's been really neat to see how that's grown and how it's engaged students. Some of whom are most plugged in are leadership students who are involved in as many ODC programs as they can fit into their schedule. But also he reaches Greek life and athletics and a lot of other elements that have brought new students into our programming in a really great way.
Okay, Dawn, I want to ask you three questions about that. One, you're a former Bucknell athlete, and you still, show me up in terms of athleticism all these years later. Pathways is a great example of
Mhm.
partnership that we've been able to create with the Bucknell athletics program. Could you sketch that out a little bit?
Yeah, that's been really neat to see how it's grown. A Pathways an alumni program 2 years ago on the future of college athletics was one of the neat ways that kickstarted. And that brought in, amongst others, Greg Schiano, who is the head coach at Rutgers football and former Bucknell football player, as well as a Bucknell football parent, Congressman Dan Muser, as well as others. And that has allowed us to foster more relationships within athletics. And so now um, we have student athletes who have taken the leadership seminar. Now that's a huge time commitment in September, and we realize that any fall athlete is not able to do that. So Bill Groover has offered leadership workshops, mini sessions designed specifically for student athletes who can't give up their entire September. We've had the entire men's and women's basketball teams participate in those, track and cross country and volleyball student athletes. So that's been a neat way to partner. We also are able to work with football more. We recently sponsored their golf outing, and it was neat to see nowadays the number of athletes that I recognize or that I've seen at a program before or are here for Pathways or they're talking to Ed in his office. But in addition to that, a couple other neat things. You mentioned Red Friday. I mean, one of the early Red Fridays before word got out too much and it blew up, but was the golf team with Coach Mike Binney. And more recently, we helped sponsor a program with Professor Paul Sievers that was honoring Bucknell's famous lacrosse coach, Sid Jameson. And the men's and women's lacrosse team said, tell me where we're heading. We'll be there. And beyond that, we have also a great relationship with Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And that's been another neat way that we are able to reach Bucknell student athletes by helping to support some of their dialogues and just to connect with students that way as well.
That's awesome. Two other follow-ups on Pathways, Dawn. You mentioned the packed out campus theater. That's also an example of bringing an alumnus back who hadn't been around in a while. Could you give a quick sketch of what the campus theater was filled for?
Yeah, that was a screening of a documentary called Rising Hope, which is about poverty and the economy of of the Mississippi Delta region, and that was a former Bucknell football player who developed that documentary after taking some service and missions trips when he was a Bucknell student. So that documentary screening, and then a Q&A, not just with the filmmaker, but with several of the community leaders from Mississippi who were a part of that. Took place in on the first day of class of the spring semester. It was, I think, about 3 degrees outside. I said, Ed, I'm so sorry. And, this was still worth doing, Ed, but it's 3 degrees out and they've got to get over to the campus theater. And it was packed out. So the football team showed up for that. And it was a really neat way to, again, kind of live our model where we can share stories and perspectives that students don't have a lot of access to, but then create further dialogue after the fact.
Great. And one more thing about that series, Dawn. We've had a lot of successful financial people visit Lewisburg, Pennsylvania because of the works of the ODC. But there was one who visited this year for the Pathways seminar that was a little different than the others. Can you share a bit about that?
Yes. So this was really special because actually a few years ago, two students came to me and said, Dawn, we really would love to bring an alum to campus named John Rusnak. And so I had a chance to meet John over Zoom 2 years ago, thanks to these students. But the timing, the students ran out of time before they graduated for us to be able to schedule this. And said, Dawn, I can make this happen. This is perfect for pathways. And John's story is incredibly powerful. He was at the peak of success that many Bucknell students that he had aspired to on Wall Street. He was a very successful banker, and but he also committed a major crime and lost the bank millions and millions and millions of dollars. So then John went to prison for, I believe, 5.5 years, and his life completely turned around, and has spent his years since prison um, to help others make changes in their life. And so to have him share so candidly about you know really making one of the biggest mistakes that anyone could ever conceive of, and that there is life after that, and what you can do with that, and when he speaks very candidly about how he could have turned around on the negative path he was heading on. He could have turned around earlier, and he let it get worse and worse. But then when that all came to light, when things bottomed out, how he has rebuilt from there. So again, these are just the kind of conversations that are really meaningful and deep, and that I'm grateful we can expose students to.
Yes, very meaningful indeed, Dawn. And I'll just say for the benefit of our listeners that if Dawn got your attention with that description of the last Pathways event, it was recorded. So log on to your
Mhm.
device, and in addition to hearing our beautiful voices, you can hear that one for yourself. We can't record everything that we do, but that one was particularly important, and I'm grateful we were able to do that. Now, Dawn, we could talk about new series until 2026, and
Yeah.
our mutual families would not appreciate that because we would miss Christmas. So I want to move forward a little bit. One of the beautiful things I think about 2025 is how so much of our work has built upon itself. We've talked about some things that started before
Mhm.
2025 and are stronger now. But even I think there's a few examples of programs that have grown out of programs. So one of those, and this
Mhm.
is a great example of a partnership, is our American Revolution series, which came out of Red Friday, because a local historian started coming to Red Friday, met some kids from ROTC, which is not a new partnership, but I think is a much strengthened partnership in
Mhm.
2025, creating a new and exciting program that started this fall, is going to continue next spring, and is tied to the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country, which is truly going to hit in 2026. Could you share a little bit about that with our listeners?
Yeah, this is another one of those really pleasant surprises. I was not a student who would have been enticed by an American Revolution reading group. I just have to confess that right now. Um,
You were enticed
but
by a track and field. I was enticed by history, and we work across differences at the ODC.
Yeah, exactly. um, so when we put this together, I thought, you know what, we'll have a few students there and they'll have a great discussion. And even that is very worthwhile. But ROTC was so enthusiastic about that on 4 or 5 Tuesday afternoons this past semester, we had about 30 cadets and a few other students who are not ROTC cadets taking part in this reading and lecture and discussion series. And this is neat because it's also complemented by some quarter credit courses that are being taught with support by ODC this year on campus, in conjunction with America 250 as well, taught by Professor Sievert. The founding documents as literature being one of them. So that has been a true delight, and they are continuing in 2026 as well. There's more to talk about, but it's been really a really strong program for us, and one of those that I'm always thrilled to be wrong about.
Another great example of our work building upon itself. If you think all the way back to the beginning, when we created Professor Bill Groover's leadership seminar, the whole idea was we can create a place where people who are not on the Bucknell faculty can bring really
Mhm.
important knowledge and experiences to bear for students. And we always thought, if it works for Bill, we can do it with others. Well, one of the examples where that worked, also interestingly enough, on fall Saturdays this year, was the civic leadership series taught by our colleague, or led, I should probably say, by our colleague, Kendi Alvarez, class of 2006, your classmate, mayor of
Mhm.
Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, veteran of several of our events. She represented the Democratic side of the aisle in our election debrief in 2024. Really interesting experiment there. Brought in some interesting speakers, various other alums who are in public life, as well as Bucknell president John Brobman. I love that what we started 5 years ago and what we initially pioneered with Bill has now created that model for someone totally different than Bill, for a group of students interested in something totally different than Bill. You know, being mayor or magisterial district judge or state senator is very different than Wall Street and some of the experiences.
Mhm.
Although Bill was also a mayor, so I guess he and Kendi have
That's
that in
true.
common, but a very
Yeah,
different
but
lens.
mhm, exactly. And what Kendi put her finger on, and really what she came to us to say was, hey, um, these positions are really important. Civic leadership is hugely important, and we want great Bucknell students to be looking at this path as well, and to forge better connections, whether it's those as careers or just being involved and engaged community members. It's really easy to lose sight of that when you are 20 years old and not paying attention to taxes or to trash cleanup in your neighborhood or to where you want to raise your family. But if we can start that awareness in those conversations now, it's really just going to have incredible impact down the road. So that was really neat to see her take the initiative on that approach, and for those students to have great exposure and then to be able to get more involved in ODC programs. I think when we started advertising that, I called you up all excited because I said, Charles, guess what? I don't recognize any of the names of the students who signed up for this. Um, and that is something that's exciting for me, and something that's just a big difference from when we started out. And I could probably rattle off the names of any student who had attended more than one program for ODC. So that's just another kind of little example of our reach.
Yes, great example of the growth of the student audience that we're serving, Dawn. One of our areas of partnership that shouldn't go without saying is faculty members.
Hmm.
We often are in the blessed position of being able to put funding and other resources, manpower, et cetera, behind great ideas that faculty members have. And you mentioned a couple of those. We've sponsored courses, 4-credit courses. I believe that was a first in
Hmm.
2025.
Hmm.
There's more coming in 26, as you stated. But two of our best attended events this year were specifically, they weren't part of a series, they were part of a partnership. They were part of standing behind faculty members who really had a great idea and wanted to get something done. And they were both years in the making. One of them was Professor Chris Ellis wanted to have Mark Hetherington from UNC Chapel Hill talk about polarization in society. And the second was Professor Paul Sievers wanted to have Senator Rand Paul come to campus
Hmm.
and talk about foreign policy and the Constitution, something he has had a lot to say about during his time in public life. Both of those happened this year. The Rand Paul appearance, I think, probably got a lot of airtime on with our followers, listeners, viewers, et cetera. I think a lot of people know that a sitting senator came to Bucknell, and it was a first, and it was great, and it was recorded on public television right around when Senator Paul voted to defund public television. That was through
Yes.
the generosity of our advisory board member, Scott Henry. And if any of our listeners missed that and they would like to spend the holiday season with Senator Paul, you can find that on our website. And we're really thankful that not only could we give that experience to students, but it's out there in perpetuity, thanks to Scott and his generosity. I think Mark Hetherington's visit got maybe a little bit less attention, Dawn, but very, very important. I was there that day. That was one of the very first programs that we did in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And I can't prove this to you mathematically. I didn't tap everyone there in the room on the shoulder and ask them, but it felt to me like the topic had and that recent horrible event had something to do with why so many students and even some community members, vast majority students, but a few community members, came into the Elaine Langone Center at noon on a Monday. And we've got some great photos of that. What are your reflections, Dawn, on either those two events or some of the ways that we've been able to partner with faculty this year?
Well, what's really unique about both of those two events is that in Wall's Lounge, it kind of represented the my takeaways from both of those. So after Senator Paul gave the televised portion of his talk in the terrace room, he spent another, at least an hour with 30 or so students in Wall's Lounge answering any questions they had. And we opened this up to Professor Seaver's students and to leadership seminar students. This was an intentionally small group to give them access that probably most of them realistically will never have with a US senator, again, for the rest of their lives. And that was just a really awesome dialogue to see. And I know these students came from all different backgrounds. And the level of kind of candor that there was really, representative again of what we're trying to foster. But it was also in Wall's Lounge where, a professor who I just guarantee you that no student could, rattle off Mark Hetherington's name, before this program. It's not that he is famous amongst the 18 to 22-year-old crowd. But thanks to the partnership with Professor Ellis, the courses that he teaches and the relationships that he has with his students, this was a really exceptionally timely topic of political polarization. And that Wall's Lounge was packed at lunchtime. And again, with a bunch of students I didn't know, which is pretty neat. And what I loved about that program was his ability to kind of break down the ways that polarization has manifested itself and where we can kind of see that and why, and make it to bring really that academic approach to something that can seem, very us and them, very other, and that it gives students the kind of the tools to understand it better, which means that they're going to be able to better reduce polarization in their own circles.
Beautiful. Dawn, before we move off partnerships, I can't resist one other thing, in the spirit of the season. We talked about Hanukkah and the events of this week. One of the most important partnerships we've had, we said it before, is with the Jewish community at Bucknell. We have strong relationships across the faith community. Many different groups have attended some of the events that you talked about or that we talked about. But especially this year, we have needed to stand behind the Jewish community in a unique way. Not because we're a religious organization. We don't have an opinion on Judaism or Christianity or Islam or atheism or anything else. But we do have a very strong opinion on the fact that you should be able to practice your faith, exercise freedom of speech, talk about whatever, and be safe. And we were able to provide that environment for Hanukkah. We were able to provide that for all the other holidays for the Chabad chapter. We were also able to provide a place for the first event of the new chapter of students supporting Israel, where a couple of IDF, Israeli Defense Force soldiers, came to Lewisburg and talked about their experiences over the last couple of years. And it was really poignant for me, and I know for you and everybody else on the team, because the day after those soldiers came to our building in Lewisburg, they went to Toronto to another similar event, and they were attacked and injured and hospitalized. And why didn't that happen at Bucknell? One, because our team worked our tails off, because that's what we do, but also because of generosity. And specifically this year, we received a special gift from our governing board member, Joe Quintillion, designed to support that particular partnership, because Joe felt at this particular time in history, it was really important for us to execute this part of our mission. That was briefly discussed in previous episode where Professor Bill Groover talked about how important and meaningful that all is to him. I can't let it slip before we move off the topic of partnerships. And a couple last things I wanted to talk with you about, Dawn. One, we're almost to the point where you get to share your memory, your most important moment from 2025. But we've talked about new series, we've talked about new partnerships. The last one was new places. Most of this discussion has been about our alma mater, Bucknell University. One of the really special memories I have from 2025 was being able to watch my old professor, Bill Groover, teach for credit on other campuses. Bill taught for credit at Lebanon Valley College and at Susquehanna University this year. Got to accompany our board chair, Susan Crawford, to Villanova University earlier this year, where she addressed a group of law students about military law. A couple weeks ago was at Manor College outside Philadelphia, where watched a fellow Bucknellian talk about being a young CEO and what it takes to get there and how you can do that. And we now, as you know, have regular programming happening in the Philadelphia area and a lot of interest from a lot of these other colleges and universities. To me, that's not just a 2025 thing, that's a 2020 thing. Because when we started this organization 5 years ago, we believed if we do a great job advancing the mission of open discourse at our alma mater, number one, that's going to be a credit to our alma mater in terms of its reputation and its opportunities at this time in history. But secondly, there would be other partnerships. There would be other people who would see what we were doing and say, hey, we'd like some of that. To me, it's just a full circle moment to think about how that's actually happening now, and that's going to accelerate in 2026. And we can talk about that the next time you come back on the Open Discourse podcast. But before we sign off, now is your opportunity, the moment that our listeners have been waiting for, Dawn. As you reflect back on this year, what's the most meaningful moment to you?
Well, it's not just a moment, it's kind of a series of moments. And so you shouldn't be surprised that taking your question and answering it how I want to answer it. And it starts, though, at the debate that we hosted in October, featuring two state representatives, Jared Solomon and Martina White, Democrat, Republican, male, female, both from Philadelphia, debating the Trump presidency. And this was a special program in and of itself to me because it was happening about a month after Charlie Kirk was assassinated. It was happening amidst big immigration debates and tariff battles. And they were talking about President Trump. And this is a topic that, we hear so many horror stories from campuses on all of these topics about really ugly, dialogues. And I'll use scare quotes on that because they're not really dialogues, but that is what we hosted. And it was a really civil discussion and they disagreed on almost everything. They found a little bit of common ground and they were nice to each other and they hugged at the end. So I was proud of that debate, but that wasn't actually my favorite part. This debate was moderated by a student, Garrett Van Blarcom Deloise. Garrett's a Bucknell senior and international relations major, and he is our first student moderator of a program like this. He was nominated by Professor John Doses, who we've had the pleasure of working with. And I was very nervous about this. I thought, I don't know. politicians talk and talk and talk and talk, and they might fight. And boy, this could get away from us so fast. But Garrett just handled it with really great maturity and poise, and he prepared for it, and he had interesting follow-ups, and I was so proud of how he handled it. But like I said, it was a series of moments. Garrett was not a student that I knew super well before. He had been a little bit involved in ODC, but after that debate, the timing was just really fortunate that we offered a field trip to Washington, D.C. So, Charles, not only have we been expanding beyond Bucknell by partnering at these other institutions, we're already also taking Bucknell students to new places. So 2 weeks later, Garrett was on that bus with about a dozen other students where they had the opportunity to meet with Senator Dave McCormick, who had invited our students to his office. They had an opportunity to visit the office of Bucknell parent, Congressman Dan Muser, to have kind of a discussion led by one of our students who had interned there, Sam DeLuca, who's been on the podcast. We went over to see where Judge Susan Crawford had presided, and we spent about an hour with a justice who was just taking questions from our students about all sorts, about the military code, about military justice. And we got a tour of this beautiful old courtroom. And let's see, then we went to the Department of State, where we met with an advisor to the Secretary of State and got a private tour of the diplomatic reception rooms. It was just incredible. So Garrett got this really neat, add-on experience. But wait, there's more. About a week after that, we had interviews at our office for a DC academic summer internship program through an organization that is separate from ODC, but that we know of thanks to shared values. And Garrett was able to find out about that and apply to that. Garrett has since attended other programs, and I'm happy to tell you he recently applied for research grant funding along with Professor Dosis, which he was, as of just a few days ago, awarded. So he'll be continuing on doing some really unique research thanks to the support of ODC's research funding and, thanks to our donors. So all this to say is that Garrett is an example of the growth of ODC. It used to be students attend a program and hopefully apply for the leadership seminar, which is limited. That's a cap number of students. Those are the two great ways to get plugged in. But now, as we've talked about over the past hour, there's internships, there's research grants, there's field trips, there's 4-credit courses, there's extracurriculars, there's discussions or reading groups at our office. And there's so many other points of entry to ODC, but not just entry, but towards then deeper involvement. And so Garrett is just a really neat example of that. But there are more Garretts, and that's brought me the most joy this year.
Dawn, your answer was worth waiting for. If our listeners want to delve more into that, they can see and hear what Garrett did on a previous edition of this podcast. We also have had an episode and a half kind of debriefing the DC trip. As you mentioned, Sam DeLuca did a previous interview that people can listen to. And our last episode, Mike Binney, who helped make that successful, also had a lot to say about it. So listeners, if Dawn has piqued your curiosity about any of those events, you got a great opportunity over the holidays to sit back with your beverage of choice and delve more into the work you've made possible. Dawn, thank you for a great year. Thank you for an energizing conversation. And we're going to make all this look modest in 2026.
That's right.
Thanks again for listening to the Open Discourse podcast. This podcast is brought to you through the generosity of the Shearer Group of Companies in State College, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to keep it going, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and consider making a donation at opendiscoursecoalition.org/donate. See you next week.